and we're talking to Andrew Johnson about Dr. Judy Wood's new book, Where Did the Towers Go? And this book was described by Professor Eric Larson as the most important book of the 21st century. So who's Eric Larson, Andrew?
Right, yeah, well, he's a professor of English. He's retired now, but he basically has written a book called A Nation Gone Blind, which is basically about how Americans are having difficulty seeing all the problems in society that have been created over the last 20 or 30 years, with the things like the creation of the Patriot Act and all that side of things. And I think because he'd written about some of those topics, I don't know the full story, but Dr. Judy got in touch with Eric Larson, and they started to correspond, and then he was ultimately asked to help edit the book and write the foreword, which he said he was honoured to do. And that was his response. He felt that once he'd seen the evidence, and this is a professor of English, he's not a scientist, but he could clearly see from the study what the significance was.
Mm-hmm. All right, well, in addition to the actual dust, which doesn't tie in with controlled demolition, there were a whole range of other bizarre phenomena.
That's right.
Now, where we're going to start, Andrew?
Well, I mean, some of my favourite, for example, are the upturned cars. I quite often go to this one first because to me it's one of the most immediately inexplicable ones. Mm-hmm. When you see a row of cars and you've got most of them are the right way up, and then there's one that's the wrong way up. Mm-hmm. I mean, how do you explain that? Mm-hmm. So people will look at it and say, well, obviously, Andrew, what happened was, there was a blast of wind from the towers coming down, and that turned the car upside down. Well, if that was the case, then why a few feet away on some of the pictures do you have all the leaves on the trees? Because if you've got a wind strong enough to turn a car upside down, it's going to blow the leaves off the trees. Right. And this sort of thing, or blow the branches off the trees, and none of those things were seen.
Now, there were damage to cars which seemed to have heat damage in one section of the car's bodywork, with right next to it no heat damage at all. Let's just say it was an energy weapon. This weapon seems to have been selective over the areas that it's having an effect on. So, can you expand on that, Andrew?
Well, this was something which, Dr. Wood recognised early on because of her experience with interferometry. Now, for those that are not familiar with this technique of interferometry, it's where you get two sort of light sources, for example, or in fact you get the same light source, a coherent source of light such as a laser beam. Mm-hmm. You split the beam using a diffraction grating, and then you recombine the beam with mirrors, and then you make the length of the path one wavelength different, and you'll get constructive and destructive interferences.
Yeah. Anyone who's done O-level physics or A-level physics will know about interference fringes, right, and constructive and destructive interference.
That's right.
So the two beams create a whole sequence of almost on, off, or effect, no effect, effect, no effect.
That's right.
Crests and troughs.
Yeah, that's right. Right. Exactly.
So she believes that what I just described earlier, with that part's affected and that part isn't, it's an interference fringe pattern.
That's exactly right, and this is what was seen, for example, where there were regions where the cars essentially were all parked in a line, or in the parking lot, for example, car park, and you will see a pattern of damage where there's regions where there's heavy damage, and then next to that there's regions where there's no damage, and then further along there's more damage. So you're seeing this as an interference effect, with destructive interference in one place and constructive interference in another place.
All right. So what about jellified metal?
Yeah, I mean, this is
jellified.
Yeah, jellification. This is basically metal which seems to have melted, but apart from the melting, there's no other evidence of heat. There's no charring, there's no burning, there's none of the effects that you normally get with the heating metal otherwise, and you've got materials merged together, such as metal and paper have kind of like merged together into a single blob.
So as if something at an atomic level has been going on.
Correct.
Right.
And this is where Dr. Wood eventually tied this in with what's known as the Hutchison effect, because both the interference effects and the jellification are what's seen with John Hutchison's experiments There's several other effects which have been documented as well. So this is where the jellification is essentially an energy effect, because you're seeing effects on the metal, but with an absence of heat. Which how do you change metal without heat?
Now, John Hutchinson is I don't know if you would say a controversial character, but someone who perhaps isn't part of mainstream science, who did experiments in the 1980s with microwaves and other generators, and, as you claim, was visited by Colonel John Alexander. So you believe that the Hutchinson effect was something similar going on to what's happened in 9/11?
Yes,
what would you say to people who say, well, no, this Hutchinson guy is just a crank who was twiddling knobs and doing faked videos? Or, are you not tainting the evidence by even bringing his name into it?
Right. Well, this is what has been claimed, and in fact, the way that you've put that is what's certain members of the 9/11 Truth, quote unquote, movement have said exactly the same thing. The problem is that really, when you look at the effects that John has repeatedly demonstrated over the years, and then see those reproduced in the evidence, that really seals the case. Now, so it's not so much to do with his education, but it's to do with the effects that he's able to create. And if people go onto the internet and Google his name, they'll typically come up with a Wikipedia page. And on that Wikipedia page, it claims that John Hutchinson is not able to reproduce his effects, which is untrue. We've seen, for example, a video taken in 2007 where he was visited by Rob Simone and his friend. They were making a video, and he demonstrated levitation to them. Within probably a half an hour or an hour, he was able to reproduce, and this is on film. It's not a particularly clear example, but you can see it. You can see it happen. So, and John Alexander makes no secret that he visited John Hutchinson. He talks about it. I've got audio of him talking about it. So it's not a claim that he visited him. He did actually visit him, and he spent 4 months working with him.
And another of the bizarre effects, if we just move off the Hutchinson effect, is these circular holes, which we've discussed in the past on a previous show. What does Judy Wood make of these circular holes, which appear to be, they don't appear to be just damage done by something which has just collapsed. They look like they've been punched in, for want of a better word.
Right.
What does she conclude about the holes? Or
well,
what does she say about the holes?
Right. Well, just to sort of clarify the description a little bit, if you look at World Trade Center Building 6, you'll find pictures in the book and on the website of World Trade Center Building 6, and you'll see these circular holes in the tops of the building, and also they appear to be in the street and in the other sort of regions of damage in the building which have a circular effect within that damage. The holes in the top of World Trade Center 6 do seem quite circular, but there's other areas where you can see the circular hole, but it's within the debris pile.
Right.
So it's not like crystal clear, but once you can see it, it's definitely there. And originally it was considered that, obviously, when you're looking at something like that, you're looking at it as if it's something above the buildings that's caused these holes, some type of, something, maybe even, she originally sort of suggested in the original broadcast, which caused all the controversy, that this thing might be orbital, but she didn't actually say it was, and she didn't know if it was.
So she was asked, where
it was,
is this alleged energy weapon located?
Right.
And she replied that it might be orbital.
Correct.
Which then created, a kind of a reaction from certain people who say, "Oh, this is crazy space beams." Was the words used.
It was misquoted. That was never actually said by Judy, Dr. Judy, but it was then taken that she had said that.
So that was then used as a kind of a lot of people who were reporting on various 9/11 researchers' work would then not touch this work or not look at this work because it was people were using this word space beam to discredit the work, or the analysis.
Correct, and that was taken up by Steve Jones. He used that description to try and.
Okay, now for me that doesn't seem so implausible. This is just my own personal view. I'm not referring to the book here. We've got hundreds of satellites in space that beam down vast amounts of data in radio waves. They're all over they're in orbit. Now, it doesn't seem a huge leap of the imagination to be able to do the same with a microwave and cause damage with it. You know, so I'm not saying it's microwaves, but all I'm saying is that to me, I mean, we know what damage lasers can do, for example. You know, it doesn't seem to me to be beyond the bounds of reason to be able to put something in space which can cause damage to a building. I mean, that's not crazy at all in my view.
Right.
So, and I'm not speaking for Dr. Judy Wood when I'm saying that. I'm speaking for myself, my own thoughts on it. So for her to be ridiculed because all she said was, well, it might be orbital, seems just, you know, ridiculous.
That's right. I mean, it was taken out of context, and it wasn't, you know, and you've made some valid points there that we do know. I mean, you know, we had, and the way that it was really misinterpreted was because she essentially, you know, just went a little away from what you said and talked about the SDI program, the Strategic Defence Initiative.
Yes.
And she was essentially arguing that a lot of classified technology was developed then, and possibly we might be looking at some piece of technology from that, which was involved in these events. She didn't say that's exactly what happened, but she was just, you know, there was evidence that those weapons could have been developed in the SDI program. Yeah. And then those two things were put together and taken out of context, and that's what's been then used, as you said, to put a lot of people off. But since all that has been going on and on and on, it's never gone away, and it probably never will go away. But for example, if you look at some of John Hutchison's experiments, he's actually had some of his samples have had circular holes in them, but he hasn't been using like a microwave beam above his experiment. He's been using it, creating those holes using interference effects. Right.
So let's just talk about this briefly then. The actual, if it's a free energy weapon or energy weapon, then the weapon must be housed somewhere. Now, let's speculate as to. I know Judy doesn't speculate in her book. She looks at the evidence, but if we can do that, I mean, where could it be? I mean, we were discussing this before the show, and you said that it might only be the size of a suitcase.
Yeah, well, this again is my speculation, because what John Hutchison does is he has 2 tons of equipment, or he had until he sold it a few months ago. He had 2 tons of equipment, which is microwave generators, radar equipment, ex-Navy equipment, and he was beaming his sample area with these various types of energies, frequencies, and amplitudes of various wavelengths. Particularly, you know, with microwave frequencies being involved, and he was essentially creating these effects. He also used electrostatics and magnetic fields as well. So you know.
So these were placed around the object then?
Yeah, around a region. I mean, essentially, if you think of a region the size of this table we've got here in the studio, that was a sort of sample area that he would put a piece of metal in, or several metal samples. And the generators would surround that region, and then the effects would be created within that region.
So there could be 4 buildings a quarter of a mile away with 4 devices in them. With something else, could be in a plane or a helicopter. Yeah. So you basically don't. And I guess this is part of the problem for getting people on board with this analysis. Is that you can't pinpoint where the alleged weapon was.
This is one of the things. You know, people want to jump to the answer. Because we're so used to having things pre-packed, you know, you're given an answer, you spoon-fed it, right, on to the next thing.